Today I want to talk about a teaching strategy called peer teaching. The basic idea is simple. Instead of students always being the ones receiving information from the teacher, we give them opportunities to explain, question, coach, and teach one another. Now, this does not mean that the teacher steps out of the picture. The teacher is still responsible for planning the lesson, presenting accurate information, correcting misconceptions, and making sure learning actually takes place. The difference is that students become active participants in the learning process. And there is an important principle behind this. Sometimes the best way to learn something is to have to explain it to someone else. Here is where we're going today. First, we're going to define exactly what peer teaching is. Then we'll look at why it can be effective. We'll talk about things like retrieval, explanation, feedback, metacognition. We'll also look at some of the research behind peer teaching. Then I'll show you a simple peer instruction cycle that can be used in an actual classroom. After that, we'll look at some practical examples from different subjects. And finally, we'll finish with a few key takeaways and a short activity. So, what exactly is peer teaching? Peer teaching occurs when students take an active role in helping another student understand something. That could be as simple as one student explaining how they solved a math problem to another student. It could be a student explaining a scientific process. It could be two students discussing why they believe a particular answer is correct. Or it could involve a student teaching a small portion of a lesson to classmates. But there's an important distinction. Peer teaching is not simply putting students into groups. If I tell students get into groups and work on this, that doesn't automatically mean peer teaching is happening. There needs to be specific learning objective and specific responsibility. The teacher designs the experience, establishes expectations, and then allows students to do some of the cognitive work themselves. So, the teacher isn't being replaced. Instead, the teacher becomes more of a designer, a coach, an observer, and evaluator of the learning process. Why would having students teach other students actually help them learn? There are several reasons. First is retrieval. When I ask a student to explain something, they have to retrieve that information from their memory. They're not simply recognizing an answer on a worksheet. Second is explanation. A student may think they understand something until they actually have to explain it. When they try to explain it to someone else, they may discover, wait, I don't really understand this part. That's actually a good thing. Third is feedback. A peer can ask a question such as, why does that happen? Or how did you get that answer? That forces the student to think more deeply. And finally, we have metacognition. That basically thinking about our own thinking. Students begin to recognize what they know, what they don't know, and where they need additional help. So peer teaching isn't simply about helping another student. The student doing the teaching is also learning. So what does the research say? There's a significant amount of research examining peer tutoring and peer instruction. For example, a 2025 meta-analysis examining peer tutoring in STEM education combined 24 studies involving more than 3,300 participants. The researchers found a positive effect on academic achievement. Other meta-analyses have found positive effects from peer tutoring and peer instruction as well. One particularly interesting finding is that the student who does the teaching can benefit as well. A 2019 meta-analysis looking specifically at the achievement of tutors found a positive effect. That makes sense when you think about what we just discussed. If I have to teach something, I can't just vaguely understand it. I have to organize the information. I have to decide what is important. I have to explain it clearly. I have to answer questions. All of those things require deeper thinking. Now, we do need to be careful with research like this. These effect sizes come from different studies, different populations, and different outcomes. So we shouldn't treat these numbers as though they're directly comparing identical experiments. But overall, the research provides encouraging evidence that well-designed peer teaching can improve learning. This slide gives us a simple model that can be used in almost any classroom. It begins with a question or a task. The teacher gives students something meaningful to think about. Second, students think individually. This step is important. If we immediately put students into groups, some students will simply wait for someone else to answer. Giving them individual thinking time means every student has to engage. Third, students teach a peer. They explain their answer or their reasoning. Then comes discussion and defense. The other students can ask questions or challenge the explanation. And finally, we recheck and reflect. This is where the teacher comes back into the process. The teacher can correct misconceptions, clarify the concept, and determine whether students actually understand. So the cycle is think, explain, question, defend, check. That is a very simple routine, but it can be extremely powerful. There are 5 things I would keep in mind when using peer teaching. Number 1, give students something specific to teach. Don't simply say, teach your partner. Give them a question, a problem, concept, a diagram, or a passage. Number 2, train the routine. Students need to know what successful peer teaching looks like. Number 3, require every student to think first. Otherwise, one student can become the teacher while the other student simply watches. Number 4, use questions that require reasoning. Instead of asking, what's the answer? Ask, how did you get that answer? Or, why do you think that's correct? And finally, always close the loop with teacher feedback or a check for understanding. We don't want students teaching other incorrect information and then moving on. The teacher still needs to verify learning. So what does it look like in a classroom? Let's make this practical. In science, one student might explain the process of photosynthesis, while another student labels a diagram and asks questions. In math, students can solve different problems and then teach their partner the process they used. And I would emphasize the word process. We don't want students simply saying the answer is 42. We want them saying, here's how I got 42 as my answer. In English, students can defend an interpretation of a story or explain why they selected a particular piece of evidence. And in history or Bible, students can teach a passage, historical event, a person, timeline, or cause and effect relationship. The important thing is that peer teaching isn't limited to one particular subject. It's a strategy that can be adapted to almost anything. Now, the teacher still matters. This is probably one of the most important slides. Peer teaching does not mean that we turn the classroom over to the students and hope everything works out fine. The teacher still matters tremendously. The teacher chooses the content. The teacher establishes the objective. The teacher designs the activity. The teacher decides how students will work together. And perhaps most importantly, the teacher listens. As students are talking, the teacher can walk around the room and listen for misconceptions. At the same time, there are some things we need to watch out for. One student might dominate the conversation. Students might confidently explain something that is actually incorrect. The classroom might become loud without actually becoming productive. Or students may complete the activity without actually learning anything. That's why structure is so important. Good peer teaching isn't less teaching, it's different teaching. So you should try it. Let's actually experience this for ourselves. Think about one concept that students frequently misunderstand. Maybe a math concept. Maybe it's a grammar rule. Maybe it's a Bible doctrine. Maybe it's something from science or history. Now imagine that instead of explaining the entire concept yourself, you ask the students to explain it to one another. One student explains it, the other student listens and asks why or how questions. Then they switch. What's interesting is that when you have to explain something to someone else, you quickly discover that whether you really understand it or not. That's one of the greatest strengths of peer teaching. It turns understanding into something students have to demonstrate rather than simply something they claim to know. 3 takeaways. If you remember only 3 things from this presentation, remember these. First is active. Students learn actively when they're explaining, defending, questioning, and applying ideas. Second, structured. Peer teaching works best when the teacher provides clear expectations, clear roles, and meaningful questions. And third, transferable. This isn't just a strategy for one subject. You can use it in science, you can use it in math, you can use it in English, history, Bible. You can use it in almost any classroom. Ultimately, peer teaching changes the role of the student. Instead of simply asking, "What did the teacher tell me?" the student begins asking, "Can I explain this to someone else?" And that is a much deeper level of understanding and learning. These are some of the research sources behind the information in this presentation. They include research on peer instruction, peer tutoring, and the effects of student teaching other students. One of the things I found particularly interesting in this research doesn't simply suggest that the student receiving help benefits. There is evidence that the student providing the explanation benefits as well. This is really the heart of peer teaching. When students explain, question, defend, and apply what they're learning, they are doing more than completing an assignment. They're practicing the process of thinking like a learner and communicating like a teacher. And that's ultimately what makes peer teaching such a useful classroom strategy.